So before we get started, I just want to address an issue of semantics, and I'm going to be using the term pet to replace companion animal. And although we all recognize and realize that companion animal is the more appropriate term, the reality is that pet food, is the common parlance. And for the purposes of what we are doing at Because Animals, which is speaking to individuals who already love their cats and dogs, right? So they already have a very close connection with their cats and dogs. We need to speak to them in a way that they can relate to in order to sort of convince them that there are these other animals that they should also be considering, which are, of course, cows, pigs, chickens. So we're going to speak, I'm going to just use the word pet in replacement of companion animal, and just to give you that heads up. So I'm going to begin by sort of addressing the question that most people think of first when they think of cultured meat. If you don't yet know what cultured meat is, we'll come to that. But the question that most people think about when they think about cultured meat is, when could a product actually be available? And that's because currently there are no cultured meat products yet available. Unfortunately for us, we've been working very hard. My team scientists have been working very hard, and we are looking to launch our first cultured meat product, which will be our Harmless Hunt mouse snacks for cats. And we're aggressively working towards launching this product in mid-2024. So still too long from now, in my opinion, but actually, the time will fly, and so we are getting there. So I'm going to back up now and sort of tell you the story as to how this company came to be, why we're doing it, what we're doing. And so I'd say it all began a long time ago. I grew up with 3 dogs, 3 cats. They were my siblings, they're my best friends, and I developed a very close relationship with animals at a young age. For me, I was able to sort of early on make the mental shift and see that my cats and dogs, cows, pigs, although I didn't live on a farm, I didn't engage with those animals, nonetheless they were, I could see very, very early that there's clearly, we are all sentient beings. So I stopped eating meat at a young age, and then from there I went on in my early teens volunteering at various animal rescue organizations, and I continued to do that sort of throughout my adult life as I moved from one city to the next and so on. But the other thing, the other aspect of my life that was very important to me is studying science. So I'm a scientist by training. I did a master's and a PhD in chemical biology, and then I went on to, I was really, really lucky, and I went on to do a postdoc at Stanford University, and I'm in, again, chemical biology. And while I was there, the one great thing about this place in the world is that anything and everything is possible. And something that I had been deeply uncomfortable with, despite loving science and really, really enjoying it, is that the reality is if you are a researcher in science, most likely if you're doing anything that's related to, that's going to be translational into sort of human therapeutics, your work is going to touch an animal. And this is that had always plagued me, and despite the fact that I didn't do any work on animals, that my work could be used by someone else to continue to further whatever it is the objective was. So while I was a postdoc, I did actually there was one incident, and our lab was next to a lab that was a cancer lab, and normally, if you're not familiar, in academic institutions, usually the animal housing area is very, very removed from, the general academic lab where everybody's working. But in this particular instance, is one day I remember, the image was seared into my brain. I was walking through the labs, and there was some of this odd, there was something odd going on. I saw a light that was focused on sort of a bin, and I went over and I looked, and there was a mouse, and that mouse had been intubated, and it was just laying still with its eyes open, and I thought it was dead. And then it suddenly started convulsing, and then it stopped, and then started convulsing again. And I had never seen this before, and so I quickly told the scientists in the lab, whose mouse is this? This mouse needs to be euthanized immediately. Why is it still alive? Because typically, at least I had understood in the academic sphere that with respect to animal work, people would do it, but as soon as it got to the point where an animal was suffering, that animal would be euthanized. And in this particular instance, that clearly was not happening. And so I made some commotion, and people were scampering about trying to figure out whose mouse this was, and eventually somebody they did euthanize the mouse. And then what surprised me was the backlash that happened after that. So I suppose, so I brought this to my supervisor, and the supervisor from my lab spoke to the supervisor whose mouse it was. And in this particular instance, this was an endpoint, referred to as an endpoint experiment. So basically, they had special permission to perform this experiment and to allow that animal to continue to live as long as was required until it died. So they could actually harvest the tissue, and they could get the information that they required. But the point is, they were not under any obligation to euthanize the animal early, because it wouldn't have captured the necessary scientific information that they needed to get. And I didn't know about these endpoint experiments prior to this, and it was in a rage and in a and just in a sudden instant, I thought, like, fuck it, I'm on the wrong side of the line. I'm not just going to sort of remain here and complacent to this type of work. So I indicated this to my supervisor, and I decided, yeah, that was the end for me. I was prepared to leave academia to science altogether. But before just completely, renouncing science, I said I was, again, fortunate to be in this place in the world where anything and everything is possible. And this was back in 2016. And so luckily for me, it was at this time when there was some real amazing stuff happening around me in terms of researchers innovating by way of food. So these folks called Mufree, who's now Perfect Day, they're creating milk without the animal, so recombinant protein. They were in the very, very early stages. These guys called Clara Foods. They had also just come onto the scene. They're making egg white. And then importantly, Pat Brown, who's the founder of Impossible Foods. He was a friend of my supervisors. So I was really lucky to be in this environment that absolutely supported this type of innovation. And so I thought, yeah, these are my people. I'm going to go in this direction. And so at first, of course, I thought, okay, well, good. So I'm going to work on, creating a product to replace another for humans, because of course humans are the main consumers of animal-based products, and this makes sense. But then I just started to think about it a little bit more, like, what product would I want? Because I've lived for almost, my entire life, very, very happy and healthy with what options are available to me. So but I thought, the challenge for me is really, actually, I'm still really hamstrung in having to support animal agriculture because I'm buying foods for either my pets or the pets that I'm fostering, or, and so this is sort of just an illustration to show that, yeah, if you're walking through the grocery store for yourself, depending on what grocery store and where you are in the world, but there's a good chance there's some plant-based section, especially if you're in a city. If you walk through a pet food aisle or a pet food store, every product in there is going to have, if it's nutritionally complete, it's going to have animal-based products in there. It's going to have meat. And so, so for me, this just seemed like, well, yeah, this is a product that when I think about what product would I want, this is the product that I want. I want a product that I can feed my pets, my cats and dogs, without supporting this industry that I otherwise don't support. But then, sort of talking about this and brainstorming with some other people, they said, yeah, okay, I get it, but actually, is that really going to move the needle at all? Pet food, focusing on pet food, because, of course, many people think about pet food as actually being a sustainable industry. So despite the fact that, okay, we might hate that it comes from animals, nonetheless, this is meat made from animals that are, by and large, it's the 50% of the meat that humans don't want to eat, combined with what are referred to as fallen animals, or animals that die due to dehydration or during transit. So they die before slaughter, and if an animal dies before slaughter, it cannot be sold for human consumption. So in fact, this industry, the pet food industry often actually makes the argument that in fact this is a sustainable industry. And it's this meat, as I'm talking about, this 50% of the animal that humans don't want to eat, combined with the other 4D meat, or animals that are dead, diseased, dying and disabled, they're sent to something called a rendering facility. So the reality is this meat, this otherwise unsellable, inedible meat, is just basically sort of stacked up. Of course, it becomes heavily contaminated with lots of pathogens, bacteria, and then it needs to be sterilized. And so it goes to something called a rendering facility where it's heavily processed for decontamination. So heat to very high temperatures, subjected to high pressures, and this kills all the microbes that otherwise grew on that meat. And now it is safe for animals to eat because it has been decontaminated. When I started thinking about it like this, and sort of understanding this particular detail, and looking at, so the actual, the rendering association is very large. It's a $21 billion industry in and of itself. And so actually this organization called NARA, North American Renderers Association, previously they were the NRA, Renderers Association, the North American Renderers Association. No, they added the A in there is the point, because I guess that's conflation between National Renderers Association and National Rifle Association. Anyway, I'm going off track. The point is that when I sort of started to understand the details, it really occurred to me that it was clear that pet food is not a sustainable industry, but what pet food is doing, it is otherwise supporting the most unsustainable industry on the planet, which is animal agriculture. Because in the absence of being able to sell all of this otherwise unsellable meat, in terms of the profit margins, animal agriculture as we know it could simply not exist. So, and then just to think about this a little bit more in terms of the quantity, and NARA themselves have published this, in terms of the quantity, if all of this rendered meat could not go to pet food, it would have to be disposed of as biohazardous waste, because it is. And that would mean, in terms of quantity, all landfills in the US would be full within 4 years. So, so clearly there's a real incentive to get rid of this product, and to get rid of it in a way that's very, very financially viable. And that's pet food. So with all of this together, that's when I decided, okay, this is it. Pet food is that is my niche. And that is where I'm going to be able to move the needle, especially because at the time, and actually still to date, there are very, very few people focusing on pet food. It's really quite a white space. So then next was, okay, do we create, what product do I create for our cats and dogs? Do we create a meat alternative, which I think about meat alternatives and I think about plant-based largely. Or do we create an alternative meat, meaning meat, but just produced in an alternative way? So there's some complexity around, creating a plant-based product for pets that doesn't exist in the same way that it does for humans. So of course, humans who are omnivores, most people, not everybody, but most people recognize that humans are indeed omnivores and can and do live long, healthy lives eating a plant-based diet. Dogs are, taxonomically, they are classified as carnivores, but metabolically, they are omnivores. So actually, dogs are metabolically much more similar to you and me than they are to cats. Cats who are both taxonomically and metabolically classified as carnivores. So because of this, basically what this means is that when we think about humans, as omnivores, there's buy-in that we can create plant-based products for humans, and that's okay. They can replace animal-based products. But there's very, very little acceptance around this idea that we can feed our dogs and cats a plant-based product for reasons of, again, this taxonomic classification of dogs. So dogs who absolutely can live and do live long, healthy lives eating plant-based. But regardless, people don't believe that, or they don't know it. They think about dogs as being wolves, and they think about dogs as requiring meat. And so it doesn't matter, sometimes it doesn't really matter what the reality is when you're trying to sort of sell a product. If the majority of people have an idea that something is right, it can be very difficult to change people's minds. And so this is where the decision came from to say, okay, we know we can create these plant-based products for dogs, and we can even create plant-based products for cats, actually, because cats are carnivores, but in the wild they are carnivores, which means that they need to consume another animal in order to obtain all of their nutrients in the wild. But in reality, when we are talking about commercial pet food, right, which is a product that is manufactured in a manufacturing facility, it is possible to get all of those nutrients that cats need from non-animal sources. And people often think about taurine being the real, that's the real kicker in terms of the nutrient. Taurine only coming from other animal sources. And cats, it's an absolute necessity that cats consume taurine. The irony, though, is that cat food actually, almost all of it, all cat food, the major source of taurine in cat food is actually a synthetic source. So there's a statistic that over 50% of the taurine that's made in the world actually goes into pet food. I think the other 50% or 40% goes to Red Bull or something. But the vast majority is sold into pet food. And so the reality is that taurine, which in an animal in the wild would of course be, it would be contained in that animal. Once that meat is rendered, so it's subjected to those high heats and pressures, taurine being a very water-soluble substance, it's actually lost into the media, it's depleted from the meat. And so many of the nutrients that cats need, taurine being one of them, those have to be added back to the food post-processing. It's called a premix. And that's why when you look at your pet food, you see a long list of vitamins and minerals that are actually added back to the ingredient list. That's because the meat no longer contains all of those essential vitamins and minerals that cats need. They have to come back, and they come back largely from synthetic sources. So it's sort of a funny, if you will, thing that much of the pet food industry, cat food industry, could actually be making a vegan product, and that meat is really there as a biomass. It's there as a filler, but from a nutritional perspective, it's contributing protein, but we know we can get protein from lots of different sources. So protein is not the limiting piece here. It's those other nutrients like taurine, arachidonic acid, vitamin A, but those are synthetic. Doesn't matter when you think about customers, and customers want and believe that their pet needs a certain ingredient, which is meat. You've just got to provide them with meat. And I determined that it would be faster and cheaper to create meat, cultured meat, than it would be to actually set off on some, incredible marketing campaign to try and actually tell people otherwise, because people have tried it and it's failed. So that's where this is where we started, okay, we're now focusing on, rather than creating a meat alternative, we are creating meat, and we're just creating that meat in an alternative way. So we actually started with mouse being the ancestral diet of the cat. So in the wild, cats eat mice, they eat small birds, and insects. Although most commercial pet food is made with chicken, beef, fish, those are also the main allergens for our cats and dogs. So in making cultured meat, we really saw this as an opportunity to create the protein source or fat source that's most evolutionarily appropriate for our pets. So we focused initially on mouse for cats. And then for the next cell line, which we have not worked on yet, but we are looking at either a rabbit or duck for dogs. Again, sort of thinking about this ancestral theme. And this is also very big in the sort of pet food world, right? You see these carnivore, ancestor types of messaging. So with the thinking that this will appeal to people. So if you're not really sure what cultured meat is, which would be normal. I can tell you, it's a very, very simplified high-level explanation. So basically, what we do is in a one-time instance, we take some cells from an animal and then never go back to that animal again. But we then take those cells and we provide those cells with all the nutrients they need to grow and survive outside of an animal. And we do this in something called a bioreactor. A bioreactor which also is used to grow things like bacteria and yeast cells to create probiotics and beer. And so those cells, those single cells, they're in this bioreactor that is basically an environment that is temperature controlled, and it's filled with nutrients, and those cells take up those nutrients and they grow. And so that's what we're doing with animal cells as opposed to bacterial or yeast cells. And then in the end, ideally we're harvesting a product that is it is meat, it is animal tissue, but that animal tissue is not propagated on or in an animal. So some of the things that we've had to work on, and the whole, some of these slides might be a little, I didn't tweak all of them, but some of them might be geared more for investors. But anyway, they're still informational. So some of the things that the industry has to work on, when I say the industry, I mean cultured meat industry. One of the big bottlenecks or an Achilles heel of the cultured meat industry initially was growing cells in the absence of something called fetal bovine serum, or FBS. So fetal bovine serum is exactly as the name implies. It's basically that serum that surrounds a fetus. And when a pregnant cow is slaughtered, that serum, or even before she's slaughtered, it is extracted. It's a very painful and humane process. That serum is very, very nutritionally replete. There's lots of nutrients in there, and because of course it's meant to nourish a growing embryo. This means that it is often used to grow cells outside of the animal. And so for folks in the academic world working on doing any kind of, almost all of them working on any kind of cell-based, animal cell-based application, they're using FBS, or fetal bovine serum. So, but of course, as a company that's working towards taking animals out of the supply chain, we are not going to continue to use an animal-based ingredient in our process. And then just another caveat to this is that FBS being, of course, an animal ingredient, animals being complex organisms that have lots of variability. I read a statistic at one point that actually something like 70% of the papers, academic papers that have been published that use FBS are not reproducible, and there's no real surprise there because FBS is not what's referred to as chemically defined. It means it's a complex set of nutrients that comes from that animal, and it's not all of those individual nutrients are not analyzed in every batch, and so that means from one cow at one time point to another, there's going to be variation. And so the sad thing is, in my mind, this type of ingredient is being used to support cells to grow in an academic and a scientific environment, which ideally, the foundation of science is that it's reproducible. And in many instances, it's not, because this is not a chemically defined ingredient. So it leads to variations in results. In any case, we needed to eliminate FBS from our process, and it's not so easy because FBS is something that, because it's not chemically defined, we actually don't know all of the nutrients that are even in there. So that was a bit of a feat. That took some time and doing for us to pull that out of the media. So basically, what we had to do is we had to try to identify nutrients that would be, again, they would be of course animal-free, sourcing these nutrients animal-free, and then removing FBS and replacing them with other ingredients that could potentially serve to allow cells to grow. So that took a little bit of time. It took a couple of years, but eventually we got there, and now we have a fairly robust media, we believe, that is a very good price point. That's sort of an aside, but we do need to I need to constantly be thinking about costs, because commercialization is our ultimate objective. The next thing that we needed to do was, or at the same time, we needed to think about cell lines. So of course, any company that's making cultured meat has to also think about what cells they're going to be growing. So generally speaking, there are two ways that a company can go about making cultured meat. One of them is by using what are referred to as immortalized cell lines. These are cell lines that grow indefinitely and aggressively outside of a body. And that's because they necessarily contain a mutation that allows them to do this. And if that mutation existed in a body, it would be cancer. So immortalized cell lines are very, very, very normally used in scientific research. They're used in, so for example, vaccine production. And so they're very useful and they're very helpful. But from the perspective of actually using them for meat, although nobody's ever gotten cancer from eating cancer, it's really a disgusting thought. So we steered well clear of this immortalized cell line route, and we're instead working with something called pluripotent stem cells. So stem cells are amazing in that they are the only cells in any body that naturally continue to grow forever. But in addition to that, in addition to them continuing to grow forever, as long as they're in that pluripotent state, pluripotent means that they can, once they are given a cue or a signal, they can turn into any cell in the body. So they can turn into a fat cell, they can turn into a bone cell, a heart cell, a muscle cell. So, you know, so very, very incredible cell type. So, so we're working with stem cells, and so basically for our process, what we are working on, what we do is we grow our mass, we grow all of our cells up as pluripotent stem cells, and then in the last step, we then say, we allow those cells, we say, okay, we're going to take away this particular component in the media that keeps you pluripotent, and we're going to just allow you to now turn into the cell type you want to turn into. And then in the case of our, at least one of our cell lines, those cells, the majority of those cells, typically they start to turn into fat quite naturally. And that's actually very good for us because fat is cats, being obligate carnivores, they have a higher nutritional requirement for fat than we do. And there's actually one fat in particular called arachidonic acid that we can make from precursor molecules, but cats can't. So they require consuming full arachidonic acid. It's one of those things you might find on your ingredient list of your cat's food. But anyway, so the nice thing is our cells are actually forming fat and arachidonic acid. So this is great. So and then the next thing that we're doing, I'm actually almost done for, so just in case anybody's getting tired of listening to me. But the next thing that one of the other tools that we're using is we've developed, we're actually introducing some artificial intelligence to our research. So we've developed a platform, an artificial intelligence platform, which we've called Clairvoyant, or Claire for short. And so sort of the history behind this is, I mentioned I'm a chemical biologist by training, and most of my work was directed around antibiotic drug discovery. So it was in the pharma field. And when AI hit the pharma industry about a decade ago, it reduced the time and the cost of bringing a drug to market by 70%. Empirical science is very slow and it's very expensive. So you know, I was really, really gung-ho on introducing some technology that could allow us to reduce costs and as well as speed up our process. So so we have at the moment we only have one, but we have a mathematical modeler who's developed the system for us, and then in the next steps, yeah, we'll be hiring a couple of more folks to continue to build this out. But in essence, what this allows us to do is it allows us to actually visualize complex metabolic pathways that we otherwise wouldn't be able to, and from there, actually gain insight as to what nutrients we could add to our growth media that would allow cells to, say, for example, grow more robustly, or it would enable us to take out other nutrients that are still really too expensive and replace those expensive ingredients with cheaper, but just as nutritious ingredients. So all of these efforts are with all of these efforts, we're working towards launching our first product, which I mentioned is our Harmless Hunt mouse snacks for cats. And we're aggressively working towards launching this product in mid-2024. This will be dependent on regulatory approvals because cultured meat, to date, it's only been approved for one company in one country, which is Singapore, and it was approved for a company called Just. That was back in 2020. So right now, Just is selling some of their cultured meat, where they're using a cultured chicken. Small quantity of that meat in with, I'm actually not sure whether or not the rest of the meat is plant-based or if it's actually slaughtered animal chicken cells, but in any case, they are selling that product in restaurants, select restaurants in in Singapore. So for us, we're speaking with the FDA, as well as the EU Commission and the UK and Singapore. And so, ideally, we'll launch our products in as many places as we can get regulatory approval. And hopefully, we will have regulatory approval in one of those places by 2024, so that we can get this thing on the market. But so right now, still to date, it surprises me because I started the company, 6 years ago now, and I said at the time that it was a white space, and it still is, which is bizarre to me because it seems, in my opinion, cultured meat is such a great application. Pet food is a great application of cultured meat because we don't have to worry about creating all that scaffolding and three-dimensionality the way the human food industry has to, which is a real challenge. And because, of course, cats and dogs are largely viewed to be carnivores, so plant-based is just never going to be a substitute the way we see plant-based substitutes in the market for humans. So. With that, I'm going to finish. I guess it's a bit early, but I personally don't like sitting through long talks, and so I don't like to give long talks, and so I would rather just have time to sort of chat and go back and forth questions, if that's okay with everyone.